My school wouldn't let me graduate because I'd missed school to fight leukemia. I turned it into the best thing to ever happen to me. But I got even worse news on my real graduation day. I was standing in line at graduation when the principal pulled me aside and said I wouldn't be getting my diploma. "You missed 87 days for chemotherapy. I'm sorry, but policy is policy," he said, while my parents sat in the bleachers thinking they were watching their cancer survivor son graduate. I had a 4.0 GPA and spent every chemo session doing homework, but he said none of that mattered because I hadn't logged enough hours in the building. I'd have to repeat senior year just to make up attendance days I'd missed getting poison pumped into my veins. I spent the summer watching my friends leave for college while I prepared to sit in the same classrooms with kids a year younger than me. My oncologist wrote a letter to the school board explaining that missing school for cancer treatment shouldn't count as truancy, but they voted 7-0 to uphold the decision. The superintendent said making exceptions would set a dangerous precedent, even for dying children. My mom cried every morning dropping me off at the building where everyone knew I was the kid who beat cancer but couldn't beat the attendance policy. Teachers looked at me with pity while I sat through lessons I'd already mastered. The worst part was seeing my empty chair at college orientation photos my friends posted. Then Elizabeth transferred in from another state and sat next to me in creative writing without knowing anything about my situation. She just saw me writing in my notebook during lunch instead of eating and asked if she could read it. I'd been documenting everything from the diagnosis to the chemo to the school treating me like a criminal for surviving. "This is insane," she said, reading about how they made me repeat senior year for staying alive. "You need to turn this into a book because people need to know this happens." She started eating lunch with me every day and helped me organize my notes into chapters about radiation burns and attendance sheets. We spent afternoons in the library with her typing while I talked about throwing up between classes and still maintaining perfect grades that meant nothing. She never treated me like a victim, and that's why I started falling for her while she turned my pain into paragraphs. Elizabeth's dad worked in publishing, and she sent him my manuscript without telling me. 3 weeks later, he called, saying he wanted to publish it and thought it could help change policies nationwide. The book came out in February, and suddenly reporters were calling the school, asking why they punished a cancer patient for getting treatment. The principal held an emergency assembly telling students not to talk to media about internal school matters, but someone leaked the video of him announcing my failure to graduate. My story went viral, and other kids started sharing how the school failed them during medical crises. Parents flooded board meetings with printed chapters from my book, demanding explanations. The superintendent went on local news claiming I was exaggerating and that the school had always been supportive, while my chemo port scar was literally visible on my neck. By April, the book hit the New York Times bestseller list, and I was getting invited to speak at education conferences about antiquated attendance policies that kill kids. Colleges that had rejected me because I was still technically in high school started calling with full scholarship offers and apologies. The school board held emergency meetings trying to do damage control, while parents demanded answers about their inflexible policies that valued seats filled over lives saved. I did an interview on national television where I thanked Elizabeth for believing my story mattered and showed the rejection letters from the school board dismissing my cancer as an excuse. The host cried on air reading the chapter about missing prom for chemo, while the school marked me absent and failed me in physical education. Graduation day came again, and this time I had a real diploma waiting, but also a book tour starting the next day at cancer centers across the country. The principal had to hand me my diploma in front of 800 people who'd all read about what he did to a dying child. His hands shook as he was forced to smile for the photo, while knowing everyone saw him as the villain in a best-selling book about educational cruelty. Elizabeth was valedictorian and used her entire speech to talk about how institutions fail vulnerable students and mentioned me by name 5 times. The crowd gave me a standing ovation when I walked across the stage, while the school board members sat frozen in their seats. After the ceremony, I was taking pictures with Elizabeth and my parents when the headache hit me so hard I dropped to my knees. The same headache I'd been hiding for weeks because I couldn't miss any more school. Elizabeth caught me as I fell, and I saw the terror in her eyes because she'd read every word about my symptoms in the book. "It's back, isn't it?" she whispered as my vision started going black and I tasted metal in my mouth. My mom was screaming for someone to call an ambulance while my dad held my head. The principal walked by and actually smiled when he saw me on the ground bleeding from my nose. "Guess you won't make that book tour after all," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Someone in the crowd shouted that they were recording everything while the sirens got closer, and my blood kept dripping onto the blue graduation gown that took me 2 years to earn. Elizabeth pressed her hand against my forehead and told me to keep my eyes open, while my mom pushed through the crowd of parents and students who were all staring at me on the ground. The EMTs arrived in 4 minutes and immediately started checking my pulse and blood pressure while asking Elizabeth what happened since she was the calmest person near me. She told them about my cancer history and the headaches I'd been hiding for 3 weeks, because I couldn't miss any more school days, and I saw the older EMT's face change when she mentioned the word leukemia. They got me onto the stretcher while my dad grabbed my diploma from where it had fallen, and my mom kept saying everything would be fine, even though her voice was shaking. The principal stood 20 feet away, watching with his arms crossed, like he was waiting for us to clear out, so graduation could continue. Elizabeth climbed into the ambulance with me, and when the EMT said only family could ride along, she just said she was family and sat down next to me. The younger EMT started an IV, while the older one asked about my medications and treatment dates, and Elizabeth rattled off every single drug name and dosage from memory because she'd been helping me organize my medical records for the book. She mentioned the ceterabine and the daunorubicin and the dates of my last scans and how I'd been getting headaches that made me throw up, but kept going to the school anyway. My parents followed in their car while the ambulance rushed through red lights with the siren blaring, and Elizabeth holding my hand so tight I could feel her pulse racing. The ER was ready for us when we arrived, and they moved me straight to a trauma bay, where a doctor who looked younger than my dad started ordering tests. He wanted a CT scan first, and then an MRI, and blood work to check my counts, and the whole time Elizabeth stood next to my bed taking notes on her phone. While we waited for the scan results, she finally let herself get mad at me, telling me I was an idiot for hiding symptoms when I knew what they could mean. She was crying and squeezing my hand hard enough to hurt, while saying she couldn't believe I'd risk my life just to avoid missing school after everything they'd already put me through. The CT scan came back, showing something concerning, so they rushed me to MRI while my parents sat in the waiting room getting updates from Elizabeth by text. The MRI took 45 minutes, and I could hear the machine banging and clicking while I tried not to think about what it might find in my brain. Dr. Jonas Reed came to see me 2 hours later with the results, and he didn't waste time with small talk, just pulled up the images on his tablet and showed us the spots. There were 3 lesions in my brain that looked like what we'd all been afraid of, and he explained this meant the cancer had crossed into my central nervous system. He was younger than my last oncologist and talked faster, explaining that CNS involvement was serious, but they had new protocols that were showing good results. Jonas started me on high-dose steroids right away to reduce the swelling in my brain while we waited for more detailed pathology results. My parents asked him 20 questions about survival rates and treatment options, while Elizabeth typed everything into her phone so we wouldn't forget anything important. The steroids made me feel wired and sick at the same time, and I kept thinking about the principal's comment about missing the book tour, while nurses came in every hour to check my vitals. That night, my phone started buzzing nonstop with notifications, and Elizabeth showed me that someone had posted the video of the principal's comment online. Parents from the coalition who'd been fighting for policy changes were furious and sharing it everywhere, and someone had already started a petition calling for him to be fired. The video had 8,000 views by midnight, and people were tagging news stations and education reporters in the comments. I was too tired and scared to care about revenge right now, just wanted to know if the treatment would work this time. The next morning, Jonas's wife, Melissa, came to my room carrying a folder and introduced herself as someone who ran a foundation for young cancer patients. She'd heard about my story from her husband and read my book overnight, and she wanted to help coordinate my medical care and the advocacy work so I wouldn't have to choose between them. She had this calm way of talking that made everything seem manageable, even though I had cancer in my brain and the whole internet was watching my principal get destroyed. Elizabeth's dad called that afternoon to talk about the book tour, and he'd already figured out how to switch everything to virtual events I could do from the hospital or home. He'd contacted all the venues and they were fine with me appearing by video, and he promised this wouldn't hurt book sales or the message we were trying to spread. 3 days into treatment, after I'd had time to process everything, the reporter who'd been covering my story since February called asking for a statement about the principal's comment. Elizabeth helped me write something short that said I was focused on my health and hoped the district would focus on fixing policies instead of protecting administrators who were cruel to sick kids. The school board announced an emergency meeting about the principal's behavior that would happen Thursday night, and parents were already organizing to pack the room. I watched the live stream from my hospital bed with an IV pumping steroids into my arm while hundreds of parents filled every seat and stood along the walls. The board members looked scared as parent after parent stood up to talk about the video and demand accountability for how the principal had treated a student with cancer. After 2 hours of public comment, they announced they were placing him on administrative leave while they investigated his behavior at graduation and his handling of my case. A week later, I was sitting in my hospital bed picking at the bland chicken and rice they called lunch when this guy my age walked into my room wearing jeans and a college hoodie instead of a hospital gown. He introduced himself as Marcel Reed and said his parents were Jonas and Melissa, then pulled up a chair next to my bed and started telling me about his brain tumor 2 years ago without any small talk or fake cheerfulness. He showed me pictures on his phone from when he was bald and skinny like me, then swiped to show him at freshman orientation last month, looking completely normal and healthy. He told me the steroids would make me gain weight fast, and my face would get puffy, but that went away after treatment, and the headaches would get worse before they got better, but they did get better. He stayed for 2 hours just answering every question I had about what was coming, never lying or sugarcoating, but also showing me proof that survival was possible. The next day, a woman from the state education department called my hospital room phone, saying they'd received multiple complaints about my case and wanted to open a formal investigation into the district's handling of students with medical conditions. Melissa came by that afternoon with a thick folder and sat with me for 3 hours going through every document I'd need to file a proper complaint, explaining how this could force changes not just in our district, but create precedent for the whole state. She helped me write down every single time the school had denied accommodations or marked me absent for treatment, every meeting where they'd dismissed my illness, every policy they'd used to punish me for being sick. We scanned copies of all my medical records and treatment schedules, my perfect grades that meant nothing to them, the rejection letters from the board, everything that proved they'd chosen rules over compassion. 3 days later, Elizabeth set up her laptop on my hospital tray table and helped me do my first virtual book tour appearance from my bed with my IV pole visible in the background. 300 people logged on to watch me read the chapter about throwing up between classes while maintaining straight A's, and the comments section filled with stories from other sick kids who'd been failed by their schools. My parents sat just outside the camera frame watching me turn our nightmare into something that might help others, my mom crying quietly while my dad held her hand. Elizabeth managed all the technical stuff, muting my microphone when I had to cough or needed water, adjusting the camera when nurses came in to check my vitals. 2 weeks after graduation, the treatment side effects hit me like a truck, and I spent entire days throwing up bile while my skin felt like it was burning from the inside. Elizabeth brought her laptop and college prep books to my room every day, sitting in the corner chair doing her work while I slept 18 hours at a time, never asking me to talk or pretend I was okay. She'd look up when I stirred to see if I needed water or the nurse, then go back to her work, just being there without demanding anything from me. The principal released a statement through his lawyer saying his comment at graduation was taken out of context, and he'd always been supportive of students facing medical challenges, claiming the video didn't show the full interaction. Within hours, the parent coalition released 12 pages of emails showing every time he'd denied accommodations, every cruel comment he'd made about sick kids missing school, every policy he'd enforced without mercy. They had receipts going back 3 years, showing a clear pattern of punishing students for being sick, and the evidence was so overwhelming that even his lawyer stopped responding to media requests. Jonas came to my room with new scans showing the lesions were responding to treatment, but slower than he'd hoped, and he adjusted my protocol to include a more aggressive combination that would make me sicker, but might work faster. He sat on my bed and told me straight up this was going to be a longer fight than my first round of cancer. That brain involvement was always more complicated, but he'd seen kids worse than me make it through. I appreciated him not pretending everything was fine when we both knew it wasn't. Elizabeth found me at 3 a.m, hunched over my phone reading every email from the school board meeting, every comment on articles about the principal, every update about district policies. She grabbed my phone and said she'd change all my passwords if I didn't stop obsessing over school politics when I should be focusing on not dying. We yelled at each other for 20 minutes, me saying I couldn't let them win and her saying I couldn't fight them if I was dead, both of us surprised by how fierce she got about protecting me from myself. The hospital social worker came by with forms to defer my college enrollment while keeping my scholarship active, making calls to the admissions office to explain my situation. The university immediately agreed to hold my spot and scholarship for whenever I was healthy enough to start, even offering additional support through their disability services when I did enroll. One less thing to stress about while poison dripped into my veins. A month into treatment, my hands started going numb and tingly, then progressed to burning pain that made it impossible to hold a pen or type on my phone. Elizabeth suggested I dictate new chapters about this experience, and she'd type them, so we started working on a sequel about fighting cancer and the school system at the same time. I'd talk for a few minutes until I got too tired, she'd type it up and read it back, and slowly we built chapters about discrimination and chemo, about policies that killed kids and treatments that saved them. Then, the superintendent announced his retirement at a hastily called press conference, claiming it had been planned for months, though everyone knew the book controversy and federal investigation had forced him out. His replacement was a woman whose own daughter had a chronic illness and had fought similar battles with her previous district, which felt like proof that our suffering might actually lead to real change. The parent coalition celebrated quietly, knowing one victory didn't mean the war was over, but grateful that someone who understood medical struggles would be making decisions. Marcel showed up at my hospital room 2 days later with his laptop and a smile that didn't look forced. Jonas had told him about me, and he wanted to help connect me with other young cancer patients who were fighting similar battles. He opened his laptop and showed me a private Discord server where about 30 kids our age shared everything from chemo schedules to advocacy wins. I watched him type my introduction while explaining how the group met twice a week on video calls. The first meeting I joined from my hospital bed had kids from 12 states all dealing with cancer while trying to graduate or start college. One girl was fighting her school district in Texas over the same attendance issues I'd faced. A guy from Oregon was testifying before his state legislature about insurance coverage for experimental treatments. They all knew my book and started sharing their own stories about schools and hospitals failing them. Marcel moderated the meetings with this calm energy that made everyone feel heard. We spent an hour that first night just talking about the weird stuff nobody else understood, like how chemo makes everything taste like pennies, or how people stare at your port scar. The group became my lifeline over the next weeks as treatment got harder. 6 weeks after graduation, I was back in the MRI machine, trying not to think about what they might find. Jonas pulled up the scans on his computer screen and pointed to the spots that hadn't changed size. He said the lesions stopping their growth was actually good news for central nervous system involvement. Most people expected immediate shrinking, but stability meant the treatment was working. Elizabeth squeezed my hand while Jonas explained we'd continue the current protocol for another month before reassessing. My parents asked about trying different medications, but Jonas said changing course now could undo the progress. The school board meeting happened that same week, and I watched from my hospital bed on Elizabeth's laptop. Parents packed the room holding copies of my book and signs demanding policy changes. The new superintendent presented a complete revision of the attendance policy that would create automatic exemptions for medical treatment. They voted 7-0 to approve it, and even named the new policy after me. Watching them vote for something that would have saved me a year of my life felt surreal. Elizabeth was holding my hand when the acceptance letter from the local state college arrived. She'd applied to 5 schools, including 2 Ivy League ones that wanted her based on her perfect grades and valedictorian status. But she chose the school 20 minutes from the hospital where I was getting treatment. She claimed their education program was exactly what she wanted, but I knew she was lying. The other schools had offered full rides and better programs, but she wanted to stay close. I didn't know how to process someone giving up their dreams for me. Elizabeth's dad called the next morning about the book getting picked up for translation. Publishers in Germany, Japan, and Spain wanted to bring the story to their countries where similar fights were happening. The contracts meant more money than I'd ever imagined, and Elizabeth's dad suggested using it to help other families. We'd already gotten letters from parents whose kids were facing the same attendance battles. Within a week, we'd set up a fund that had already helped 3 families pay for lawyers. 2 months into treatment, I woke up one morning and actually felt hungry for the first time in weeks. I ate a whole bowl of cereal without throwing up and stayed awake through an entire movie. Elizabeth suggested we try walking to the hospital garden since the weather was nice. We made it all the way around the path twice before I needed to rest. The sunshine on my face felt like a miracle after being inside for so long. Other patients smiled at us as we passed, and one older man said seeing young people fighting gave him hope. That afternoon, the news broke that the principal was resigning effective immediately. His lawyer released a statement about wanting to spend more time with family, but everyone knew the truth. The school board had given him the choice to resign or be fired after the investigation found multiple violations. Parents had been calling for his removal since graduation day when he made that comment about me missing the book tour. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt empty about it. He'd caused so much pain to so many kids, and now he'd just disappear without real consequences. A state legislator reached out through Melissa about introducing a bill requiring all public schools to provide medical accommodations. She wanted me to testify virtually when I felt strong enough about how the current system failed sick kids. Melissa helped me write testimony that balanced my personal story with hard data about dropout rates for chronically ill students. We practiced over video calls with me reading from my bed while Melissa gave feedback. The bill had 17 co-sponsors before we even announced it publicly. My hair started falling out again 3 weeks later, and this time it hit differently. The first time I had hope it would grow back normally, but now I knew what was coming. Clumps came out in the shower and I found strands all over my pillow each morning. Elizabeth noticed me wearing a hat indoors and asked if it was happening again. I nodded, and she left without saying anything. She came back an hour later with her head completely shaved and a nervous smile. She'd gone to a barber shop and told them to take it all off in solidarity. I cried for the first time since the diagnosis when I saw what she'd done for me. 3 months after graduation, Jonas sat us all down for a serious conversation about next steps. The current treatment was holding the cancer stable, but not shrinking it enough. He recommended adding immunotherapy to the protocol, which could boost my immune system to fight the cancer cells. The side effects would be brutal with possible organ inflammation and severe fatigue, but the success rates for central nervous system involvement were significantly better with the combination therapy. My parents wanted time to think, but I told Jonas to start the new protocol immediately. The first dose of the new drugs hit me like a truck that same afternoon. My whole body started shaking and the nurses had to hold me down while Jonas checked my vitals every 5 minutes. Elizabeth set up her laptop in the corner and started typing up notes about everything happening for the virtual book tour we'd planned for next week. I managed to do the first virtual event from my hospital bed 3 days later, with 400 families watching online. A mom from Texas showed her daughter's rejection letter from their school board after missing 60 days for kidney disease. Another family sent photos of their son studying in the chemo ward, while his school marked him truant. Each story that came in made me more determined to keep fighting both the cancer and the system. Elizabeth started posting updates on social media without asking me first. She wrote about watching me throw up 6 times in one night and still trying to edit book chapters between episodes. Her post about being 18 and spending Friday nights in the hospital waiting rooms instead of at parties got shared 20,000 times in 2 days. People started sending messages about their own families dealing with illness and how it affected everyone, not just the patient. The comments section became a support group for teenage caregivers who understood what she was going through. 2 weeks into the new treatment, my body completely rebelled. My temperature spiked to 104, and my liver numbers went crazy high. Jonas moved me to the ICU when I started having trouble breathing. My mom slept in the chair next to my bed while my dad took the night shifts. Elizabeth basically lived in the family waiting room, only going home to shower and grab clean clothes. The ICU nurses let her sneak in during quiet hours to read me updates from the book tour venues we were missing. After 5 days of touch and go, my body finally started responding the right way. The fever broke, and my liver numbers slowly came down. Jonas showed us the new scans 3 weeks later and pointed to areas where the lesions had shrunk by almost half. He warned us not to get too excited since we needed several more rounds to know if it would last, but seeing those smaller spots on the screen made my mom cry happy tears for the first time in months. Elizabeth filmed it on her phone for the social media campaign. 4 months after graduation, we watched the state legislature vote on the medical accommodation bill from my hospital room. Elizabeth had her laptop streaming while my parents sat on one side of the bed and the Reed family stood on the other. The vote was unanimous, all 40 senators raising their hands to protect sick kids from what happened to me. Melissa started crying, and Jonas actually smiled, which I'd never seen him do before. It was the first law in the country specifically protecting students' education rights during medical treatment. Marcel came by the next day with a stack of legal documents. He wanted to start a foundation using my book money to help families fight their schools. We'd use the profits from the bestseller to pay for lawyers when schools refused to accommodate sick kids. Within a week of announcing it online, we got over $300,000 in donations from readers who wanted to help. The principal who'd been so cruel had accidentally funded a whole movement for justice. My brain started working better after the 4th treatment cycle. I could focus for more than 10 minutes without getting confused. Elizabeth brought her laptop every afternoon, and we started writing the sequel together. She'd type while I talked about how one kid's suffering turned into laws that protected thousands. We documented everything from the graduation collapse to the bill passing, showing how change happens when people refuse to accept cruelty as policy. The new superintendent visited us at the hospital to apologize personally. She'd replaced the guy who retired after my book came out. She promised to make our district a model for medical accommodations and started requiring all administrators to take compassion training. She brought a folder showing the new policies they'd implemented, including automatic exemptions for any student with documented medical needs. Real change was finally happening at the school that had failed me so badly. 5 months after that awful graduation day, Jonas walked into my room with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on his face. The latest scans showed no active disease anywhere in my brain or spine. I wasn't cured and would need scans every 3 months forever, but I was officially in remission again. My mom grabbed Jonas in a hug while my dad just stood there crying. Elizabeth squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, but I didn't care. We'd made it through the worst and come out the other side. That weekend, Elizabeth and I went on our first real date in 6 months. We picked a quiet restaurant where nobody would recognize us from the news coverage. We didn't talk about cancer or schools or books or policies. Instead, we talked about movies we wanted to see and whether we preferred dogs or cats and what kind of pizza toppings were best. For 2 hours, we got to be normal teenagers planning a future we'd fought so hard to have. The letter from the OCR arrived 3 weeks later while I was sitting in the kitchen trying to keep down breakfast. My mom opened it first, and her hands started shaking as she read the findings out loud. They'd completed their investigation and found the district violated federal disability laws in 17 different ways. The document was 43 pages of violations with my case as the main example, but also listing dozens of other kids they'd failed. They mandated comprehensive reforms, including new training for all administrators and regular audits for the next 5 years. The best part was that other families could use this finding as precedent in their own fights. My dad immediately forwarded it to every parent in our coalition, and within hours, it was all over social media. 2 months later, I did my first in-person appearance at a local bookstore since getting sick again. I was still weak and needed Elizabeth to drive me there, but I was determined to show up. The crowd packed the small store with families we'd helped standing in the back and board members who'd voted for the new policies sitting in front. Even 3 of the school board members who originally voted against me showed up and sat quietly in the corner. I read from the new chapters about fighting cancer while fighting the system and had to stop twice when people started crying. A mom whose daughter had lupus thanked me for giving them the courage to fight their district. 6 months after that terrible graduation day, I was finally stable enough to start planning for college. The university called to confirm my scholarship was still available and offered additional support through their Disability Services office. They assigned me a coordinator who would help manage any medical accommodations I needed. Elizabeth had gotten into a school just 20 minutes away, which meant we could see each other on weekends. We spent an afternoon looking at dorm rooms online and picking out sheets that wouldn't remind me of hospital beds. The news about the principal came while I was at a follow-up appointment with Jonas. My phone started blowing up with texts from parents in our coalition. He'd been charged with violation of civil rights based on the pattern of discrimination the investigation uncovered. It wasn't just me, but 12 other students with medical conditions he'd denied accommodations over the years. His former supporters on the school board suddenly claimed they'd always had concerns about his methods. The local paper ran a front-page story with quotes from families he'd hurt. Melissa called that afternoon with an idea about using the book money to help other families. We set up a scholarship fund specifically for students who missed significant school for medical treatment. The application was simple and focused on financial need rather than grades, since we knew how hard it was to maintain perfect scores while fighting for your life. Within a month, we had enough donations to fund 5 students. The first recipient was a sophomore with Crohn's disease who'd been facing the same attendance problems until our policy changes went through. Her mom cried when we called with the news. My final treatment cycle happened on a Tuesday morning in November. Jonas came in personally to disconnect the IV for the last time. He explained I'd need scans every 3 months for 2 years, then every 6 months after that, but the immediate danger had passed. My parents brought a cake to the infusion center, and the nurses all signed a card. The relief felt almost as overwhelming as when I first got diagnosed. Elizabeth picked me up, and we drove straight to her house where she'd set up a workspace for us to finish the sequel. We spent the next week writing the final chapters about how one kid's suffering turned into laws protecting thousands. We dedicated it to Marcel and all the young advocates fighting from the hospital beds for basic dignity. Her dad's publisher fast-tracked it for spring release, knowing the momentum from the first book would help sales. The district announced their new buddy system right before winter break. Students with chronic illnesses would get paired with academic support partners who'd help them keep up with work during absences. They based it on what Elizabeth had done for me naturally, but now formalized it into an actual program. The superintendent asked Elizabeth to help train the first group of mentors. She spent 2 days teaching them how to support without pitying and how to advocate without overstepping. I watched from the back of the room as she explained that sick kids needed friends, not saviors. The emails from other states started coming in January. 3 legislatures were considering bills based on ours and wanted advice on the language. Melissa and I spent a weekend creating a toolkit for families to use when fighting their districts. We included template letters and links to legal resources and contact information for disability rights organizations. We made it free to download, and within a week, it had been accessed over 10,000 times. As I packed for college that August, I realized I wasn't the same person who just wanted to graduate and disappear. The cancer and the cruelty had forced me to become an advocate whether I wanted it or not. My room was full of thank you letters from families we'd helped and newspaper clippings about policy changes. Elizabeth helped me pack everything into boxes while joking that we'd need a whole dorm room just for the advocacy materials. I couldn't imagine any other path now, even though I'd never chosen this one. The first award came in September while I was still getting used to dorm life. Elizabeth texted me a photo of the letter saying we'd won the Young Adult Social Justice Book Award with a $10,000 prize. I immediately called Marcel and told him we could use the money to start hiring real lawyers for families instead of just giving advice. We spent that whole weekend setting up the foundation's bank account and filing the paperwork to make it official. More awards followed through the fall, with each one bringing more attention and more families reaching out for help. Elizabeth and I started apartment hunting in October since living in separate dorms 20 minutes apart wasn't working. We looked at 12 places before finding a 2-bedroom near both our schools with enough space for my medical supplies and her growing collection of advocacy books. The landlord recognized me from a news interview and knocked $200 off the monthly rent, saying his nephew had cancer and understood what we were fighting for. My parents drove up to help us move in November, and my mom couldn't stop crying when she saw the medical organizer Elizabeth had already set up in the bathroom. The principal's trial dragged on through winter with delays and motions and legal stuff I didn't understand. Marcel kept me updated since his mom was tracking it closely for the foundation's work. The verdict finally came in February, with the judge stripping his teaching license permanently and ordering him to pay $75,000 in damages. I signed the check over to the foundation that same day, and Marcel hired our first full-time lawyer who specialized in education law. My appointment with Jonas in March started like all the others, with blood work and waiting. He came in holding the scan results with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on his face. The images showed completely clear results, with no signs of disease anywhere. He reminded me I'd need monitoring forever, but said my response to treatment was better than he'd hoped. Elizabeth was waiting in the parking lot and started crying when I gave her thumbs up through the window. The sequel came out right before spring break and sold 30,000 copies the first week. Pre-orders alone funded lawsuits in 12 states where families were fighting their schools. Elizabeth and I spent spring break doing appearances at bookstores and cancer centers and schools. We talked to packed rooms about how one cruel policy turned into a movement that changed laws nationwide. The foundation hit its 100th family in April when we helped a girl with lupus in Texas get proper accommodations. Marcel called to tell me we'd outgrown what 2 college kids could handle and needed real staff. We hired 3 more people by May, including a social media manager who helped families share their stories. The new superintendent called me the week before graduation, asking if I'd speak at the ceremony. She explained how the district had completely changed its policies and wanted me to show current students what fighting back could accomplish. I said yes immediately, even though my hands shook thinking about standing at that same podium. Elizabeth helped me write the speech over 3 nights, making sure every word showed strength, not bitterness. The morning of graduation, I put on my suit and drove to the school I'd been forced to repeat. The parking lot was full, and I recognized reporters from the previous year's disaster. Elizabeth squeezed my hand as we walked through the same doors where I'd collapsed bleeding exactly 1 year ago. The new principal met us at the entrance and thanked me for coming back after everything. I sat on the stage looking out at 800 faces, including some board members who'd voted against me originally. When my turn came, I walked to the podium where I should have graduated the first time. I talked about cancer teaching me to fight and the school's cruelty teaching me to fight harder. I explained how their refusal to accommodate my illness created laws protecting thousands of sick kids nationwide. I thanked Elizabeth for believing my story mattered when everyone else saw me as a problem. I thanked my parents for never giving up even when the system tried to break us. I talked about Marcel and the foundation and the 100 families we'd helped so far. I explained that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalyst for the changes the world needs. I said their cruelty accidentally created a movement that would outlive all of us. The standing ovation started before I finished and lasted 5 full minutes. Walking off that stage felt different from the year before when I'd collapsed in pain. This time I walked toward Elizabeth, who was crying and smiling and holding the second book with both our names on the cover. This time I walked toward my parents, who looked proud instead of terrified. This time I walked toward a future we'd fought for and won. That's it for now. I'm glad you joined me. It really means a lot. Subscribe and we'll keep making more happy memories together.